Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. Today I'm going to do a weekly reads type video, a roundup of reviews for books that I've read this week. We'll see how long it goes and I might split it again like last week. But I don't think I have too many thoughts about these books, so we'll see. It should be relatively short, as I always say. The first book is a sequel book to Ken Liu's Dandelion Dynasty first book, Grace of Kings. This is Wall of Storms. It's substantially bigger than the first one, and the next book after this is 1,000 pages rather than 880 like this one. So because it's a sequel, I can't really talk about it too much, but what I can say is the first book deals with the first generation that essentially is trying to do a revolution. More or less, that's what it's about. This book is the second generation of those characters dealing with the outcome of the first book. But it's actually really structurally interesting because it is framed around a conflict of people who attack the dynasty, essentially, that is occurring. The people ruling the throne at the moment are having to deal with an incursion of people. So right away it's going to be sort of a book about war. However, it plays with time very interestingly. It jumps back and forth, it's very malleable, and we start learning about the other culture in really fun ways, impenetrable places that we thought we could never kind of see beyond. We do. Something happens, a time period is breached, and somebody manages to get through, and we get to kind of figure out what all the factions are doing and the different machinations that are going. And then that acts as a stopgap, so it's not just all about the war, which is nice because I'm not super into war and military fiction, to be frank. And I ended up really liking this book. I give it 5 stars because the first book, the only problems that I had with it was there wasn't really any women happening. Like it seemed to go out of its way to not really have any women in the scenes beyond really peripheral weird roles. Or not weird, but stereotypical, we'll say. This has a lot of women that are really eclectic, very exceptionally drawn, wide-ranging. It basically took that critique and then just was like, how about this then? And it totally worked for me. The conflict itself, if you're not one for like battle scenes, it does work up to a major battle scene that I think was around 100 pages. And it was fun, but not the typical stuff that I go to read. But even still, just the vast improvement over the first is sort of what I take from this. Because part of my expectations of writing books is I go in and think of my expectations fresh for every book. Except with a series, you can't really do that, right? You have expectations from the previous book. And so if this was, say, a standalone book, I think it might be a 4-star read. But because it's an improvement over the expectations, hand over head, especially prose-wise as well, it was just completely exceptional and a 5-star read. Next, on audio, I read one of those books that appears in a lot of lists as top books that you have to read before you die type deal. By Céline, there's Journey to the End of the Night. So this is about a man who goes to war against the Nazis. As soon as they start shooting him, he runs away. Very clear that it is a satire, except that the focus of the satire is essentially everything, every societal construct, every philosophical notion, basically, that man has had. Everything is kind of on the chopping block with this. From that inciting incident at the beginning, he essentially just meanders about. He kind of has, it's not really an adventure, he just sort of is a pinball that bounces from one location to another, often because he's a jerk. Nobody really wants him around because he's a terrible human being. People describe this as the nihilist book. It kind of is, except that he is so not even critical. He just burns everything down to the ground, so much so that there's nothing left, and it doesn't actually say anything. It is so the number one word that I would say to describe this book is adolescent. And it's like somebody read Fight Club and thought Tyler Durden was right, and the most interesting perspective would be solely from Durden, and if he had succeeded, and everything is just garbage, we should all just burn it down, humanity is toast, we're not good to each other, and because of moral relativism, he can sort of do whatever he wants. He sleeps with people that his friend wants to sleep with. He transgresses in every single way, in every single relationship. I think there's a notion that it is sort of fair because he's also self-critical, but again, it's just very adolescent philosophical notions that are on the chopping block, and not something that in the end really communicates that much about anything. If you're in a dark place and you want to be further in the hole, maybe this is the book for you, but it isn't actually articulating anything new or interesting whatsoever. The prose work is good. The narrator fits the protagonist quite well, because I find his voice a little bit annoying and kind of nasally, and he's a very complainy person. Like, it's adult. It's like Holden Caulfield is in an adult, basically. It goes from being interesting in its critique of nationalism, of war in general, and then it just, sort of descends into the abyss, and all there is blackness, right? How is nothing interesting? It's kind of baffling why this book is on so many top lists. I have to imagine that it was something new at the time of publication and maybe influenced other people to take on similar works in which they actually do articulate something substantive. But this is just adolescent drivel, basically. It's not something I would ever recommend anyone reads, and it's something that once you drill down into it is a scaffolding to basically dehumanize any human that you come into contact with, especially yourself, right? And from that, there's nothing human about that angle. And so if you're decoupling humanity and dehumanizing people, really it just becomes a reinforced, motivated thinking in which you continue to build this cathedral of which you can continue to do whatever you want. It's baffling why anyone likes this book, basically. Next, I read Trust by Herman Diaz. This I gave 3 stars, but it is quite ambitious. So again, when I'm talking about expectations, 3 stars meets the expectations, and the expectations are quite large. It's a book that spans a fairly substantial amount of time, I think about 2 decades, and it takes a look at people that made a big profit from the Great Depression, how it came about. I guess you could say statistically, like, it doesn't go into granular detail, I would say, but it does go into more detail than you would expect from like a normal fiction read, I would think. So just go into that kind of expecting the numbers and the crunching and sort of the more detail on Wall Street as a social construct, as a like tool with which wealth is accumulated and continues to be accumulated on, as well as the ways in which it was able to be exploited, especially at those times. And then we go into a story about a woman who is sort of critiquing a memoir, or vetting, we'll say, a memoir about the initial story. And it becomes an intertextual document in which she is sort of a lens in which we can kind of critique the first half of the book, which is quite interesting because the first half of the book is the least engaging aspect, yet that becomes the point of the book. So it just really depends on if you can jibe with the beginning. There are definitely some standout sentence work in the beginning, yet it is really generally, I'd characterize as contemporary prose that are generally bland. And then the actual story is quite trite and tropey, and then it gets turned on its head when it's examined by this woman interrogating the document for spoilery reasons. So I would say by the very end, like the last page of the book, as it continues to switch up the intertextuality, we get different reframing, different characters, points of view from different points in time that continue to work together in order to tell the point of the story. And the point is made on the very last page. So for me, it barely pulled it off, essentially, because in the first half, I was definitely thinking of DNFing the book, but decided to struggle through. At around 200 pages, almost exactly, I would say, of the 400, it starts to bring in the intertextuality and get interesting. So just know that. Most people, it seems that device has worked much better. The 3 or 4 other people on my Goodreads have rated it 4 or 5 stars. So it just depends. I think if you really get on with the prose work in the beginning, it won't be work for you, and it will only continue to get more interesting as the intertextuality goes. It clips along very nicely. There's a lot of white space. There's a lot of blank pages for the transition, so it really feels almost thrillery, where you're just going through it. Next, I read The Feather Thief, and this is a nonfiction narrative book where it's been going around Booktube quite a bit, but basically it's a story of a man who decides to steal a whole bunch of really important to kind of cataloging actual species, but also important to fly fishers, and then important as like expensive objects to be owned from a museum, and then this author themselves tracking the person down and trying to figure out what exactly happened to them. And from this, a surprisingly amount of intersections occur when he's able to weave in mental illness, justice system stuff, this weird economy slash eccentric, esoteric feather stuff with fly fishing community that's really, I would say, quite granular, but also interesting. Like he does a good job of making something that sounds boring really fascinating, especially with the intersections. And just because of how the crime was carried out, as well as what was stolen, the justice system was very limited at what it was able to do. And then with the further dynamic, I guess, of the person alleged to have done it being diagnosed with a mental health disorder, it further complicated things and embroiled things. And it gets into like morality, ethics, philosophy, and then the other topics that I brought in as well. So it gets a lot done in a fairly slim volume. I thought it was fascinating. It never sort of blew me away, so it exceeded my expectations, and I gave it a 4-star, but it was never, just something. It was always interesting while never being amazing, I guess. And everybody on my Goodreads has given this 4 stars, so I think it's sort of a just very solid piece of writing, which is commendable. Next, I tried to read Behave, the Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst on audio. This is everything I hate about nonfiction. It's prose that are the exact same that you would find in a textbook. It throws a lot of maths and a lot of science at you, and then it tries to contextualize them through a specific example. But I mean, this could be a narration issue as well. It was just so dry and boring. I could not care less. And when I started to dig into whether this would be substantive for me or not, there's a whole bunch of different articles on how many holes this actually has. And so I was just like, do I want to consume something that is antiquated, especially if it is going to be a brick textbook thrown at my face, basically? And the answer was no. So I gave it no stars and I DNF'd it. And it turned me off of nonfiction, basically. Yeah, it's why people are afraid of nonfiction is what it looks like. I think if you're a nonfiction person, you're super into this actual topic. Maybe if you're consuming it not on audiobook, or you just like the narrator, which I did not, you might be able to just like power through this thing. But I stopped at the second chapter, which was about 3 hours of the audiobook, and sort of quizzed myself to figure out what I was retaining, and it was nothing. Like, the only things that I remember are the stuff that he cited at the end of it for certain studies that most people would already be aware of already, I think, like Stanford prison experiment type stuff that everyone has in the general intellect, that he was using to tie into different points, but I don't remember what the points are. I just remember the study from having known it for, ages. Then I was proven wrong about nonfiction immediately, and I consumed When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamín Labatut. This is a 5-star read, absolutely incredible. So this is narrative nonfiction married with fictional elements, apparently. It is a sort of brief history of the physicists that sort of pioneered the way, generally around World War I and World War II type stuff. I think it doesn't go much further than World War II, but it makes it completely fascinating. I wouldn't care about any of these characters in reality. And in fact, I've tried to read books on them before and not cared at all. The prose work is fantastic. The character work is amazing. The pacing is great. The narration is top-notch. And I think the shining quality it has is its character work. The actual people are so interesting, and their personalities, as well as their work ethic, what they were interested in learning, how they went about learning, tied to what they actually pioneered, the work that they did, how the work affected them, and then springboard off to a different physicist generally. Completely fascinating. It's like tricking you into learning this stuff, basically. Completely amazing. I talked to Bob from the Bobsphere, and he said this is like Sebald Light, is what he described it as. So I'll bump up reads for Sebald going forward, if I'm pronouncing that person's name correctly, hopefully. Next, I read Sea of Tranquility, Emily St. John Mandel. This was a 3-star read for me, and again, it's kind of buckles under its ambition, or the expectations it sets at the beginning. It starts off with a story in, I think it's like 1812, where a man is immigrated from Britain, exiled from his family essentially, to Canada, and a strange event happens to him. This takes course of, I don't know, like 20-30 pages or something, and then it springboards into the future, and then into the future in the future, and eventually we have all of these characters being investigated by a single person for unknown reasons to us for a while. And as it becomes clear, the characters are all tied together and are an interrogation of something systemic in the structure of the book, as well as like an interesting science fiction question, basically. So that part of it is interesting. The problem that I have with it is that there is a lot of superfluous material in it, including the very beginning, where it's like 20-30 pages to set up this dude who has a weird experience. It would be a reframe of this would be a fascinating novella or short story. instead it's got a lot of padding. There's a character that seems to be a self-insert that has the most padding of all of them. And while its intertextuality raises interesting questions, it has nothing to do with the central premise of the book, and so feels, again, superfluous. And then the wrap-up was really interesting, yet the sci-fi component felt still so uninterrogated as to feel kind of artificial to me. But this is definitely like intersections of literary science fiction. It feels kind of like Clara and the Sun, in which everybody was like, wow, this blows my mind. If you had read science fiction for the last 20 years, though, you're like, yeah, we've been pondering this question for a really long time. There's been 10 films about it. There's been 30 books that I've consumed personally about it. It's hard for this topic to blow my mind because it's like 20 years old. Kind of similar for this. These questions have been seated in science fiction for a very long time, explored better. It executes the expectation just barely enough to get a pass. I like her writing, but it doesn't blow me away. I find it just okay. The flow was excellent. It reads very quickly. It was probably a 3-hour read in total, despite the page count, because a lot of white space and, again, transitions into different chapters are, pages long, where it's like white space and then a chapter and then white space and then a chapter, etc. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't not recommend it to people, especially if you're a fan of Mandel, and if you especially don't read science fiction, this might be, a thing for you. And then I read Far From the Light of Heaven by Tade Thompson. This one I'll be really quick about. I gave it 3 stars. It was fine. It's a locked room mystery in space, on a spaceship basically, and the characters are fairly interesting, but then don't get developed. And then same thing with the world building. It's very interesting, doesn't get developed. It's very quiet, methodical paced, and slow, which I quite liked, but it just always felt like I wanted something more from it that it wasn't giving me, even though the locked mystery component was great. It executed on that just fine, but everything around it didn't really seem that pivotal to me. It could have been, transposed to a different genre or different set dressings or different characters, and it would have been generally the same. There was no like singular defining thing about it that would make it stick out, and so it's already sort of fading from my mind, but it does execute what it sets out to do. The expectation is fulfilled. And then lastly, I read Ghost Forests. I gave this 4 stars. This is I don't know much about the author, but it seems like a fictional accounting of a woman who's coming to terms with the grief that she feels for her father by, kind of going into like a memory palace, like a cascade of memories that are built around key moments that she feels for her father, that also interestingly characterize our protagonist. That's the only way we get information about her. I thought it was really effective, exceeded my expectations. It's very short, like a 3-hour audiobook, narrated by the author herself, who does a phenomenal job, I thought, which is always incredible, I think, when authors have the ability to do that for their own work. Knowing more things about it kind of would spoil it, because the specifics about any singular scene in it that stands out, of which there are 3 or 4 of them, kind of would dampen the experience for another person when you communicate it. So I would just say that I highly recommend it, and if you're into a grief memoir, as a fictional accounting, as far as I know, I don't think it's autofiction or a self-insert type situation, but I don't know for sure. I would definitely recommend it. It's got to be a really slim volume at a 3-hour audiobook, and just see if it works for you. It's a series of vignettes, essentially. Really good prose, evocative, no complaints. Good stuff. And that's it. That's the reading roundup for the week. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you've read any of these books, let me know what you thought of them. I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with me about Sea of Tranquility, but it's just how I feel about it. Kind of a similar situation to the New Egan, where it was disappointing for me, but fulfilling for a lot of other people, I'm sure, as it seems anyway. And otherwise, I will see you next video, which should be a tag after this one. Bye.